Sir, I would like to begin by asking you, what is neuroscience?
Ah, well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think the starting point is that it hasn't always existed. So I don't know, you think of medicine or plant sciences, they've existed as long as human attempts to understand the world have existed. But neuroscience is quite a modern invention. It didn't exist. The term started to come into use in the middle of the 1960s, and it was only really in the late 1970s that you got signs that this was a term being used to relate to something. You got journals. The Journal of Neuroscience was founded at the end of the 1970s. You got departments of neuroscience, and you could study a degree in neuroscience. But prior to that, it was really either part of kind of physiology, if people were trying to understand simply what neurons were doing, or in my case, more related to psychology. So I did a degree in psychology starting in the middle of the 1970s. And in those days, psychology in the West as an academic subject was very varied. And so I got lectures on Freud, but I also got lectures on the neuronal basis of how fish sense electric fields. So, and neuronal basis of vision and so on. So it's very, very mixed kind of topic. And now much of that neuroscience element has disappeared, and people who are studying psychology would primarily study human behavior rather than trying to understand the neuronal basis. So I don't know what a satisfactory definition of neuroscience, but it would be something like the study of behavior, animal function on the basis of neuronal activity. Now, that suggests it's very reductionist. It's trying to reduce complex behaviors to ultimately to the activity of single cells in networks. And there's all sorts of ways that you can study that using electrophysiology and in nowadays neurogenetics, but that's basically the approach. So it's a reduction. I would say it's something like it's a reductionist approach to behavior and activity that is focusing on the activity on the behavior and the functioning of individual cells and the networks they form. I must say, nobody's ever asked me that question ever before. So my answer, which is, I mean, that shows it's a really, really good question. And philosophers teach us that the first thing you have to do is to define your terms. You've got to say what you mean. But nobody's ever asked me to do that before. So there you go. I've given you a definition. I don't know whether I'd change it, but anyway, there you go. That'll do.
That is, can a first order definition be to study the brain using using neurons as the basis, and how behavior emerges from it in an emergent way?
Yeah, I mean, the brain isn't necessary. I mean, I don't study the brain. Brains are horribly complicated. I mean, that's part of the lesson of my book. Any brain, the simplest brain there is still way beyond our comprehension. So even small networks of cells of 30 or so cells. I mean, I use this as an example in the book. The work of Eve Marder, who's a neuroscientist in Boston, at Brandeis University in Boston. And she studies the lobster's stomach. So not its brain, but its stomach. And there are 30 neurons in the lobster's stomach that activate muscles. So the lobster eats food, and it then has to crunch the food up in its stomach. So it produces these two rhythms that activate the neurons, that activate the muscles, and kind of compress the stomach in a rhythmic way. And we do not understand, or Professor Marder, who spent her whole career studying this and is incredibly smart. She and all her researchers and all her postdocs, they don't understand how those 30 neurons, which they understand everything about, they understand all the genes that are expressed in them, they understand how they're connected, the neurotransmitters, the neurohormones that they bathe in, everything they understand. But they cannot explain how those 30 neurons produce the two rhythms that we see and why they don't produce others. They know from modeling that other groups of neurons could produce those two rhythms. And they also know that technically those 30 neurons could do something else, but they don't. They just do this kind of oscillation between two rhythms. So that's one reason why I don't study the brain, because if we don't understand the lobster's stomach, then we've got very little chance of understanding the brain. But I don't think that means it's pointless. It just means it's not my personal choice. I'd rather be able to control to a greater degree both the system that I'm manipulating, but also my arrive at a more precise understanding. So I would do one of two things. I have in my career, I've either studied single cells in the nervous system, single olfactory cells, the sense of smell, or I've looked at the behavior of the whole organism. So I've the middle bit, the brain, is still a black box to me. But I think, you know, if you are interested in brains, which is quite legitimate, then, you know, no, I don't think it has to rely on single cells. So, you know, there are neuroscientists who are, for example, if you study fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imagery, so that's where you see the brain lighting up. We've all seen images of this on the internet or a newspaper, and, you know, somebody's thinking of something and the brain lights up. And they're neuroscientists. They are interested in trying to take a neuronal level or interested in the activity of groups of neurons. However, the difference of resolution between what they are doing and, say, what I can do in my fly maggots, my fly larvae, where I can study a single cell, the difference is enormous, because I can see the activity of a single cell. They are looking at the activity of millions and millions of cells and billions of interactions. In the smallest unit of one of those brain lighting up images that we see, there are millions of cells, there are hundreds of kilometers of neurons, literally. I mean, the brain is so tightly packed, the human brain. So I think, yeah, you've kind of showed why my reductionist definition was wrong. Because, you know, people who study that level of activity are clearly neuroscientists of a kind, but they're a rather different kind from the kind of neuroscience that I do.
Okay, sir. Now I would like to ask you about, in your book, you explain how brain came to be seen as the site of reason or thinking in general.
Yeah.
Gradually.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a bit?
Well, I mean, this will be the same in, I'm sure. I mean, I know it is, because I wrote about it, but I read about it, but I didn't write about it. In Indian culture, that virtually all human cultures that I have been able to study prior to the West's conviction, the West's certainty that it was the brain that is doing the action, and that came about slowly from the 15th to the 17th, 18th centuries. So it took hundreds of years, and there wasn't a single experiment. There's no experiment where somebody proves that the brain is doing the thinking. Instead, what happens is there's increasing complexity is revealed through dissections. It becomes obvious that the brain is amazingly complicated. It's connected to all the sensory organs, which has been known for centuries, for millennia. You just got to, even if you don't do a human dissection, you look at a cow's head. You know, if you're eating a cow, then you look at its head and you can see that the eyeballs are connected to the brain. So the brain's clearly doing something. It's very, very complicated. And gradually in the West, by the middle of the 18th century, everybody is convinced that it is the brain that is doing the thinking. But that's not what it feels like. Nobody in their right mind thinks that they're up here. All our emotions are in our guts, are in our heart, and these various parts of our body, if people were going to localize thought, spirit, emotion to a part of the body, and not all peoples did. The Chinese, for example, were not interested in localization at all. They were interested in forces, in contradictory forces. But if you are going to localize thought, emotion, then you're not going to do it in the head, because it doesn't, the way we feel is primarily with our heart, because our heart races, or with our stomach. In the Old Testament, the Jewish Old Testament, the site of thought is in the kidneys, in the back of your, here. I don't know why. I mean, I would tend to put it in my heart, because that's how I feel, or in my stomach, because if I'm excited, those are the parts of my body. So what we know, it's very difficult, of course, to reconstruct these ideas. You have to either read old documents, or in cultures that didn't have writing, the contact with the West and the knowledge that was communicated very quickly makes it difficult to see back to the pre-contact times. But what we know is that in, for example, the Americas, where everywhere in the 19th century, anthropologists went and talked to the indigenous peoples, they discovered that these people thought that the heart was the center of emotion, of thinking, and they didn't think the brain did anything particular at all. Now, you'll know much more about the old traditions in India, from pre-contact with Europe, or with the West, from before the 15th century. But as I recall, it's the same general principle, that you would have thought that it was the heart. There were various nodes in the body in terms of where energy would be flowing and so on. So the only exception I've found, apart from China, China's not interested in localization, but they still get the question, is Australia. And it occurred to me, because I was trying to reach back deep into time to understand what we originally thought, or peoples around the world thought. And I couldn't find anything about Australian Aboriginal peoples, what they thought, when we first contacted them in the 17th century, what they were thinking before the West started explaining things. And I couldn't find any trace of this at all. Nothing about the heart, nothing about the brain, nothing. So I contacted an Aboriginal anthropologist and asked her, I said, look, I've looked in all these sources. I can't find anything about where Aboriginal people thought or think the mind, the spirit, emotions are located. And her answer to me was fascinating. She said, yes, it's not a question that would make any sense. It would have no meaning to them, because the human and the land are intimately connected. They are the same thing. The spirit of the individual, the mind of the individual, the feelings, and the land, nature, are all one and the same thing. So you can't ask a localization question, where is your mind? It just has no meaning, because the two land, the land, the earth, and the individuals are intimately connected. My guess is, but this is purely a guess, is that is in fact probably the typical of the earliest way of humans thinking, before you get advent of class society and completely different attitudes to agriculture and so on, attitudes to the land and nature and what you do with it. When you are as one with it, you're struggling with it sometimes because you're starving and the weather's bad or whatever, but you are still part of nature, then it would be quite reasonable to assume that your feelings are also extended in that way. So the very short answer is there were lots of arguments, in particular the ancient Greeks and probably in India as well, as to whether the role of the brain, as I say, partly because if you look at an animal's head, it's not the heart, it's not connect, there are connections with the heart through the arteries, and this is the reason. So the blood is clearly significant. The brain, the heart is clearly moving the blood, is doing something to it. Many people have thought that the blood is created in the heart, which it is not. But the brain is doing something else, clearly, because it's not generating this blood. And it's going around it. You can see all the veins and the arteries. If you open you don't have to open a human being, but if you open the skull of an animal, you can see that. And although there are the connections between the eyes and the brain, that's very, very clear, and you can see the optic nerve very easily. Everyday experience, and this is the crucial thing, everyday experience says it's your heart or somewhere else. So I'm sure that in the many, many languages of India, you have the same kinds of phrases that we have in English, that his heart was in his mouth, meaning you were alarmed or frightened. You wear your heart on your sleeve. It means everybody can see what you're like. The heart is where we love. That's this. Down here on Skype, I can see I've got a little love symbol. I like something, and it's a heart, right? It's not a brain. So, and I'm sure this is, even if you abstract from the connections with the West, I'm sure in your languages you have the same words, yeah? And if you put brain into those phrases, it sounds crazy. It doesn't make any sense. And that's because that's what it feels like. It doesn't feel like we have a brain at all. It feels like we have a heart and a body and all the rest of it. And those connections between the brain and our emotions and the body are really, really important. And for a long time, neuroscientists, psychologists tried to kind of put them away, but they're absolutely fundamental to our experience, and not only our experience, but the experience of animals as well.
It is related to the fact that every language has a word like sweetheart. Nobody has a language like sweet mind. Nobody would have a word like.
Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely. So this is a fossil. It's a linguistic fossil of an old way of understanding the world. And I was fascinated to see that in Shakespeare, in one of his plays that he wrote at the turn of the beginning of the 17th century, so towards the end of his life, there's a little song, which is the kind of bit you skip over at school because it's too boring. There's a song, because you've got the plays, people are doing things, then somebody comes on and sings a song to keep the audience happy. And this character sings, "Tell me where is fancy," and fancy means imagination, ideas. "Tell me where is fancy bred? Where does it lie? Where can it be found? Or in the heart or in the head?" So Shakespeare, what I think what's fascinating about this is Shakespeare, one, recognizes that there's an argument to be had, and people were having an argument. Nobody knew. This was a time when they were in the middle of this movement from beginning to realize that the brain's really complicated. The heart is just a pump. So the brain must be doing something, but we have no proof of this, direct proof. Not only did he know that, but he also knew that this was a joke or a reference that the ordinary public who would come along to his plays and would throw cabbages at the actors if they didn't like something, so it was risky business. He knew that they would understand this reference. So this was not just something that was known to the elite, it was something that was in popular culture, this uncertainty in the West anyway, as to where we were going. What's striking is that even though by the time that physicians and anatomists became convinced that the brain was the center of thought, it didn't make any difference to the rest of us. We carried on thinking that, I still feel frightened. I feel it in my guts. If I'm worried, I don't feel worried up here. If I'm frightened, I don't feel frightened up here. I feel it down there.
A remark on the thing you said about Australian Aborigines. Could it be true that the evolution of thinking about thinking was the push that made the, I mean, it paved the way for thinking clearly about where is the site of
Yeah,
reason, where is the site of
yeah.
thinking?
Well, I mean, I'm very wary because from a Western point of view, I'd say yes, of course, because Western science has changed, or Western thinking has changed the world. It's created the scientific approach, or what we accept as the scientific approach, and that is partly based on exactly the kind of epistemological questions that you're talking about, which were pioneered in particular or codified by the ancient Greeks. Who were thinking whatever 2,500 years ago, something like that. When Plato and Aristotle and these incredibly clever people, and they tried to think about this. And Aristotle in particular was very interested, but he was convinced that the heart, which had movement, and movement denoted life, the heart was generating blood and was generating thought in that blood as a consequence and moving it around the body. So Aristotle was completely convinced by what he knew, by his thinking about thinking, as you say, that it was the heart that was the center of emotion and ideas and everything. The brain was for cooling the blood. It was like a radiator, like a heat radiator. The blood would go up there and then could disperse, get cool. Other thinkers later on, 100 or 200 years after Aristotle, started to do dissections. Various Greek physicians argued that epilepsy is which for some reason was called the sacred disease by the ancient Greeks. They argued that this was in the brain. It was a disease of the brain, not anything else. But they couldn't prove it. And so although there was a strong thread of thought based on dissections, that the brain was the location of thought, there was no evidence. So, and again, as I say, you have this fundamental everyday experience that suggests that it's the heart or the guts or somewhere. It's not the brain. So I think you're right. The codification of that whole philosophical approach underpinned what eventually happened in the West with what we can briefly call the scientific revolution, although it was a revolution that took centuries. So the development of scientific ways of thinking and scientific experimental approaches, that eventually led to the confidence, as I say, by the late 18th century, virtually everybody accepted this.
One other point, sir. I mean, headache. We have had headaches for millennia, actually.
Yeah.
So why was it not one of the factors that people took into account? That whenever they think hard about something, they have something going here. It's a common experience.
I don't know. We'd have to go back in time and ask them. So one of the things that you often see, so we do know that in long before civilization, so perhaps going back, I think the earliest examples go back about 10,000 years, there are examples of skulls that have been drilled open. It's called trepanation. And so these are people who've had their small holes drilled with you'd used a sharp piece of stone originally, you just pulled it around. It would have hurt like hell. It would be horrible. And then you end up with a hole. And if the hole heals, if you can see the bone is healed, then you know that individual has survived the operation. So, which is pretty scary, but it did happen. And these are often presented as being, this is to let the evil spirits out. Now, there's no evidence for that at all. I don't know of any evidence about linking trepanation with spirits or mental health or anything like that any earlier than the 19th century. And you've got to remember, if you see this claim, that there are lots of ways you can have really bad pain in your head. If you
Exactly.
get a subcranial bleed, so you fall, you bang your head, it's going to bleed, and that can really hurt. So it may well be that people, or there was a swelling, and then you'd say, well, we haven't got any choice here. If you're in real pain, then okay, let's try letting the blood out. And so they would have carried out this very primitive but extremely alarming intervention. But as I say, the key point is that's often taken as an indication that the brain was seen as significant. And whilst the head was clearly significant, I mean, you close your eyes, you can't see, all the sense organs are there. And if you hit somebody on the head, they will go unconscious. But that doesn't necessarily mean to say that's where the consciousness itself is. That's a conclusion we would now draw, but that's not one that was drawn in the past. And you could think of all sorts of explanations as to why that might happen if you have a non-scientific approach based on the heart or whatever.
Could it be true that they were stuck in a paradigm where heart was the site of reason and they needed overwhelming evidence to put it away? So,
well, you could think about it in that way. I mean, I think it's more, rather than they having you're right. So there are two things, I think, which led to this persistence. Firstly, in the West anyway, Aristotle was revered. And Aristotle argued very clearly that the heart was the center of thinking and emotion, not the brain. And his ideas were taken, they weren't as powerful as in the West as the Christian ideas, but they were still absolutely fundamental. And indeed, many Christian thinkers did their best to fuse the ideas of Aristotle, and Aristotle clearly was a pagan. He wasn't a Christian. He was a polytheist. He had lots and lots of gods in his worldview. So he didn't fit at all. And yet they spent literally thousands of years trying to fit these two ideas, the theology, the kind of complicated theology of Christianity, with the complicated but rather simpler and more coherent, I would argue, ideas of Aristotle. But there's something else, as well as this intellectual pressure to accept what Aristotle said. I think the fundamental driver, as I've said before, is our everyday experience. And I mean, okay, you've got a headache in your head and you feel, but I mean, you get all sorts of pains and, you feel tired, but tiredness isn't necessarily in your head, it's in your body as well. So I think it's it's very easy to look back. And one of the issues that I've learned in studying the history of science is that you are not allowed to think that people in the past were stupid, because they weren't. They were very, very clever. I mean, they were cleverer than most of us. Certainly most of them were, the thinkers that I've studied, far, far cleverer than I'll ever be. So, and that's much more interesting, because now you've got a problem. You've got these amazingly clever people, apparently, according to us, getting it wrong. So why did they get it wrong? What is it that's stopping them from understanding something that looks so obvious to us? And this applies to virtually everything that we now know. People in the past didn't understand, and we only know these things because we've been taught them. We haven't, most of us haven't actually worked anything out. We've just read it in books or been told, so we accept it all. It makes sense. So what is it that they didn't understand, or what was pushing them, preventing them from understanding things the way that we do? I think that's the really interesting and challenging thing to try and understand when you're dealing with views from the past.
you're saying we should avoid falling prey to the vague interpretation of history of
science.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah, there is no direction. Well, I mean, so, okay, there is no direction. We are not, there's no direction to history, or certainly not, say, to evolution. But science is a bit different. So this is where it gets hard, because science builds upon the successes and failures of the past. So although we are never going to know the truth, we're never going to know everything, our knowledge now is more is closer to whatever truth might be than it was in the past. Now, that doesn't mean to say we're not getting things wrong, and there aren't big changes that we could experience in the future in understanding things in a different way. But say Newtonian physics, that's true. You know, Newton comes up with the idea, it's then tweaked a bit in the 18th century, but basically it's those ideas from mathematical modifications of Newton's ideas about 100 years later, in the late 18th century. Those are the theories that NASA and the Indian Space Agency and everybody uses. You know, India's used to put that satellite around Mars. Those are the equations. So those equations have been around for 250 years, and they're not going to change. That is as true as we're going to get. So I think there are things like that that are going to remain the same, but say understanding the nature of consciousness or all sorts of future things we don't understand, even the nature of the universe, the nature of matter. You know, there's this argument at the moment amongst physicists as to whether they can account for all the matter and the energy in the universe. And the current view for the last 20 years has been that they're missing a lot. Their theories can't account for what they call dark energy and dark matter, which account for 3/4 or more of the universe. Now, recently people go, oh, well, maybe that's not right. Maybe, you know, so there's a big argument about that because it's simply it's kind of a theory. It's based on the fact that the models don't fit the data. So one explanation is, well, there's an awful lot of stuff that we can't see, we can't detect, so it's dark. So that's another example of something that might or might not change. But in general, science is progressive in that it builds upon knowledge of the past and integrates that. It may change those data, those experiments, the interpretation of those experiments, but it builds upon it, and we know more and more. So it does have an element of Whig history, and scientists who study the history of science are generally very bad about that. Generally, what my colleagues will write is a history that leads up inexorably without any mistakes. It's a straight line generally to them, to their brilliant insights. You know, clever people who write books about their science, it's all about them, really. Whereas in fact, the interesting thing about the history of science, and the only reason we get those things right, is because we get lots of things wrong. And very often mistakes are incredibly productive. You know, mistaken theories, mistaken interpretations have nonetheless led to important insights that have subsequently led to the overthrow of that interpretation and have led to new ways of thinking about the world. So it's kind of a complicated, braided, river-like structure, if you can imagine that. So we're going to the sea, but we're going to it in lots of complicated ways, and we're coming to a delta, and then there's going to be a big lake, and then but we're heading in the same in the right direction. That was a bit of a complicated answer to a very simple question. Sorry.
No, sir. Absolutely, it was right. No, so my next question would be: can you describe some of the experiments carried out by Galen, which showed that brain has something to do with thinking, at least something to do? If it's not the site of reason, then at least some element of thinking is carried out by the brain.
Yeah. Well, so Galen is generally known these days in the West, to the extent that we know him now, as somebody who popularized the idea of the four humors. So this is the what passed for medicine and physiology in the West for about 1500 years. In fact, so Galen was working in the 1st century of the Common Era. He was a Roman citizen, but he was a Greek, but he lived in Turkey, or was born in Turkey. So quite this was a very cosmopolitan world that he emerged into. And he became a surgeon. And he was not only a surgeon, he was a writer. He codified these ideas of the humors, which are, I can never remember what they are: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and something else. I can't remember. So these are four spirits or movements in the body, and depending on whether they're in balance or not, you're well or you're not. And the idea would be if you're ill in some way, then you need to increase the amount of black bile by eating some things or by bleeding yourself. That's that kind of approach. So he codified these documents, he wrote documents, but he was also a philosopher and a poet, and he ended up working as a surgeon to the Roman emperor, and he had the biggest private library in Rome. So he was in fact a very important figure, not just this person who had this strange idea about the humours. So when he was a surgeon initially in Turkey, and then again when he moved into Rome, as I'm sure you know, the Romans used to like men killing each other, watching them. So they watched gladiator bouts. So you'd have two men, and sometimes men and animals, carrying out the most horrendous injuries, inflicting injuries on each other, or having these injuries inflicted on them by wild animals. And he would be the surgeon. He would try and understand what was wrong, how to heal these damaged, if they were still alive. He would try to heal the damaged subjects, patients. And he noticed that sometimes when there were chest wounds or there was strong blows to the chest, his patients would sometimes lose the power to speak. And he eventually carried out some dissections. This became accepted, and he carried out dissections of monkeys. He didn't actually dissect humans, so he just dissecting primates that are very much like us. And he noticed that there's something called the left laryngeal nerve. So I'm using it now. So our voice box, our larynx here, is controlled by a nerve that goes from here, and then in a bizarre route that can only be explained by evolution, but I'm not going to go into that. That's a different talk. Goes all the way down here, goes underneath the heart, and then comes up here. And this is common to all animals that have a larynx or any voice box or any way of making a noise. And he noticed that any damage to this nerve would stop the voice being produced. And this this nerve connects to the brain, connects to this part of the brain. This finally led him to do this experiment, which I advise my readers to skip over because it's pretty unpleasant. So listeners, anybody listening who doesn't want to know about it, you can skip over the next 2 minutes. So what Galen did was to carry out an experiment in public. So it's kind of like a demonstration. And he because of all his work, he had become convinced, and because of the work of Greek anatomists carrying out dissections on humans in about 300 or 400 years earlier in Egypt when it was under Greek rule, Galen became convinced that it was the brain that was the site of ideas and emotion. And he decided to carry out this confrontation with somebody who said, no, it's the heart. So an opponent, somebody from the medical establishment who believed, like everybody else, it's to do with the heart. So they take a pig, and this poor pig is conscious throughout what I'm about to describe because they don't have any anesthetics, of course. And so the pig is strapped to a table so it can't move. And the sign that they are studying is the voice, is the noise that the pig is producing. So you need to think that there's a lot of noise and discomfort and pain going on. So Galen says to his opponent, right, you say it's the heart. And we can see that the pig is making this noise. So clearly, can we stop the noise? And so they open the pig's body. It's still conscious. It's still squealing. And his opponent puts his hand into the body and holds the heart. And Galen's telling him to do this. So you can stop the heart from beating by holding it. And of course, the poor old pig carries on squealing. It's very, very unhappy. So they then open the top of the pig's skull, which would have meant a hammer and a chisel. Yeah, I said it was horrible. Okay. So you've now got open brain. Pig's still squealing. Galen pushes on the brain, and the pig immediately loses consciousness and stops making a noise. It then recovers, and you can do it again. So this was the experiment that Galen showed. I mean, he was careful. I mean, they didn't talk about consciousness in pigs, but what he said is it's about the control of the voice, because the pig, they were studying noise. That was the measure, if you want, of what they were studying. That's what they were affecting. But it was accepted that the voice was under conscious control because it is in humans. It's one of the things we do. Animals make noises. So this was taken as implicitly taken as a correlate of consciousness. It was a behavioral correlate. They didn't put it in those terms at all, of course. So Galen did this experiment in the 1st century. It was written about, everybody knew about it, and it didn't make any difference because that's not what it feels like. So the fact that Galen thought that, coupled with the fact that Aristotle, who was very, very clever and very important, he said the opposite. He said it was the heart. And the fact that that's not what it feels like meant that the experiment had no consequence in terms of how any but a handful of people thought for the next kind of 1500 years. 1400 years, yeah.
Sir, was Galen not carrying out the project that in the beginning of the book you mentioned? Steno says that you should consider the body as a machine and see where the function lies. Wasn't he doing, I mean, it is anachronistic, but he was trying to do that only.
Well, he was trying to, I think he was just trying to prove a point. These are the bits that are involved in this. Now, we would interpret that in machine-like terms. What's very striking is that, as far as we can tell, nobody before Descartes, the French philosopher in the 1630s, nobody made that connection between any machines and how the brain or the body works. So although in a way what Galen was doing, Galen was carrying out an experiment and was drawing conclusions. So epistemologically, yeah, he is trying to control things and saying, I have excluded all other interpretations, therefore this is the only one that I can adopt, that it must be the brain and these associated neurons, and neuron simply means fiber in Greek, that these fibers that I can see going from here down under the heart and up to here, they are involved in it. And you know, all his medical evidence, his surgical evidence showed that any damage to that neuron meant that, or that nerve as we would call it, meant that the patient might lose their voice. And indeed, this is still the case today. So people who play contact sports, I mean, violent contact sports like rugby, they can lose their voice if they really bang themselves on their chest. Then they can damage the left recurrent laryngeal nerve, and they may lose their voice for some time. So it's still a real issue. It can happen. It's not just something that happened to gladiators. So as I said, it's striking that nobody, as far as I know, as far as I was able to discover, used any machine metaphors. And of course they did have machines. You know, there are Archimedes drills that will raise water from 2 levels. And it's big. You have a big spiral, and if you turn it, then the water goes up from a lower level to a higher level. And they were existent in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, in the Egyptian Empire 3,000-4,000 years ago. And I guess you probably had similar things, because you know, you've got those wells that you built in India, so you've got to get the water out, you've got to get the water in, you know, and you've got a lot of people to walk up and down those steps, the step well, but you also use these kind of structures. So there were plenty of machines in the past. And above all, what Descartes was struck by that made him start to think about kind of a pressure view of how the brain might work was looking at some statues in Parisian parks in the 1630s that moved by hydraulic pressure and by weights. And he said, well, maybe that's how the brain works. Maybe we've got pressure in our nerves, and that's what causes movement. But such devices existed in antiquity. They existed in Rome, they existed in Greece, and I would be very surprised if at some point in Indian history you didn't have them too. And they'd be wind powered, you could get things moving, you could get music coming out. So these things existed at the time of Aristotle, for example, but he didn't look at them and go, oh, maybe that's how they work. So people laugh at Descartes for being silly and getting it wrong, but I think it's the other way around. Descartes was so smart because he was the first person to look at one of these machines and to say, well, maybe that's telling me something. Maybe there's something I can learn from that. What he learned was wrong, but it was, this is exactly what I was saying earlier on. It had a heuristic value. It led to discovery. It was a mistake. It was a mistaken framework, but it led to people trying to test that framework, to understand how nerves might work, what their connection with the brain was, and eventually that kind of route, that approach that he began, eventually led to the discovery of how we currently understand nerve function in terms of electrochemistry. I mean, that's not what Descartes thought at all, but that approach, which Steno, as you say, at the beginning, there's this little quote from the Danish physician, anatomist, and thinker, Steno, and he says we need to understand the brain, we need to treat it like a machine and take it into bits and understand how it works. And that's basically what science eventually started to do.
So, sir, you said there was no aha moment at which we found out that the brain is the site of thinking, of ideas, of emotions. But what is the time at which you can say certainly the scholarly consensus was in favor of the fact that brain?
So yeah, I by the kind of final quarter of the 18th century, so about 1770, 1780, thinkers, so we can't call them scientists yet because the word hasn't been invented, thinkers, natural philosophers, those kind of words, but well, scientists, let's call them that, they became convinced that in ways they couldn't understand, and of course we still don't understand, that thought was produced by the brain. There are plenty of philosophers who've been arguing this. So, philosophy has been arguing about this for thousands and thousands of years, and they didn't really have much basis on which to decide, which is part of the problem between Aristotle and Galen, for example. But by the accumulation of anatomical evidence, increasing, so the brain's complicated, the heart's a pump, to be very crude, the increases in medical care meant that people could recover from injury to the head, for example, and that in particular became apparent that if you damaged the head in certain ways, you got certain behavioral problems and thought problems, and that it wasn't a single experiment. It's just general awareness in the West in particular that as you got increased healthcare or less bad healthcare, that people were able to survive, and you could see this link between damage to the head and alteration of behavior. So by the end of the 18th century, this was widely accepted in the West.
This is related to the point I was making earlier, that the focus on mental health as a thing in itself, that was one of the push that gave this. That's what gave the push to take brain seriously.
Well, there's an aspect to that, yeah. I mean, so in the West there was a big change, partly due to some terrible scandals. So what happened, and from about the 15th, 16th century, there was a change in how mental illness in particular, or severe mental illness, was dealt with in the West. And rather than people being free to wander about and either be strange or to be, a danger to themselves and to others, they were locked up. So they were this enclosure. They were infirmed. And the French philosopher Michel Foucault has written a great deal about this, trying to understand this change in the West's attitudes to the unusual. So or it might be somebody with severe mental illness, or it might be somebody who doesn't want to live in a fixed place, fixed abode, wants to be a tramp. And these people became criminalized, and in the case of the mentally ill, or people who are deemed mentally ill, and of course that might mean you had the wrong religious or political views, they were locked up. Eventually, in the early years of the 19th century, or late years of the 18th, early years of the 19th century, this changed due to a number of, in the UK in particular, which was in fact one of the pioneers in this area, whereas rather a number of scandals of terrible ill treatment of people led to the transition from being a kind of prison to being a hospital, to being the idea that you could treat them. And this is linked also, so King George III went mad for reasons that are still disputed. There's a very good film about him, and there's lots of arguments as to, physicians still don't agree on what his problem was, but he was clearly had massive mental health problems. The king did, and this is at the end of the 18th century. And this too led to a softening of the ideas about how you could help people and what could be done with people whose behavior and ideas were clearly not simply not normal, not accepted, but were clearly destructive in various ways. But the problem then came is to, as you suggest, well, then what do you do? How do you treat them? This is still a problem we've got today, in that we're well aware of the mental health problems, but understanding, one, where they come from, two, how to deal with them, that is incredibly hard, and we have very few really good cures in that respect. So there is this change that takes place around about the same time. And all these things are correlated, yeah? So you get the confidence that's the brain, you get the development of our mastery over electricity. So in the second half of the 18th century, people can store electricity. So you can store it first in what's called a Leyden jar, which is a big jam jar, big glass jar with silver foil with aluminium foil inside it. And that will store electricity. You can store it from a lightning bolt, or you can generate electricity by getting amber and some wool. So, when you're a child, your father probably got a balloon, a child's balloon, and would rub it against their jumper and then stick it on the wall. Hey presto, magic. Well, that's electricity. And you can do the same and generate large quantities of electricity and perform magic tricks. So there were, that's where the word electrician in English comes from. These were people who generate electricity and go round the countryside. They had one trick. They would get a boy, suspend him from the ceiling, attach him to the generator. So you're creating lots of electricity, and then you'd throw feathers in the air, and of course all the feathers would stick on the poor boy. So the electricity was being used for entertainment and started to be used for therapy. So there were also traveling electricians, who would wander around with one of these generators and would give people a kind of shock therapy. So they would generate, and you could then be shocked, and this would make you feel a bit better. This eventually turned, the thing with these systems was either they were continually generated like this by rubbing amber with wool, or they were stored in one of these jars, and then they would simply discharge like a lightning bolt. So this was uncontrolled. and it convinced people that electricity could produce movement. And one of the famous, so this was done partly on things like frogs. If you get a frog's legs and you connect it with one of these Leyden jars, it will spasm, but it just does it once because then your Leyden jar has discharged. Or if you connect it to one of these generators, then it will continually spasm. But one of the most dramatic things they did was to get 400 monks, so, you know, priests, and they all held hands, and they went at one end and they connected the monk at the end to one of these Leyden jars, which is a bit like a lightning bolt, as I said. And then they all jumped as this electricity passed through them. I mean, so that's whatever, 500 meters long, more, nearly a kilometer. You know, you've got 400 people with an arm at each length. They're all holding hands like that. So nearly a kilometer could travel along. So something's moving. And eventually, when they were able to store electricity in batteries, which happens at the beginning of the 19th century, then you get the possibility of doing controlled experiments, because you can control the amount of electricity you're releasing. And it became immediately apparent that this was how bodies worked. It wasn't simply that electricity was an irritant and would produce movement, but that it would produce coordinated movement. And one of the famous examples of this was a particularly gruesome experiment done on an English criminal who had killed his wife and his child. He'd drowned them. So he was hanged, and he was taken down from the scaffold. As soon as he was dead, his body's still warm. He's put in a room with 12 members of the Royal Society, the big scientific institution. And these scientists then get these batteries they have built, and they put the electrodes on either side of his head, and then they turn up the current. And the man's eyes open, and he moves his arms, and it's like he's come back to life. Now, of course, he hasn't, but it looked like it very much. And this very soon became quite popular, not with human bodies, I'm glad to say. There's very few examples of this happening with human bodies. Mainly it was with animals. So you could, in London, you could go to the theatre and watch a display. You watch a scientist or an electrician. They'd have a cow out the back, they'd kill it, they'd bring the head of the cow on, and then they put the electrodes, and it would open its mouth and grind its teeth, and, you know, its eyes and ears would move and so on. And very strikingly, one of these displays was put on at somewhere called the Royal Institution in London, which is one of the main forums for the public communication of science. Humphrey Davy worked there for a long time. And in 1815, a young girl went to see one of these displays with electricity making animals move. And a year later, she had run off. Her name was Mary Godwin. A year later, she ran off with a notorious poet who was a few years older than her. I mean, she was only 16 at the time. She ran off with him. They got married in secret. He was a radical, notorious poet. His name was Shelley. And on their honeymoon, they were honeymooning in Switzerland, and the weather was awful because this is where it gets bizarre. A volcano had erupted the year earlier in Indonesia, and the weather all over the world was affected by this volcanic eruption. So the weather was very bad. So they had to write. They said, "Okay, we're really bored by the side of this lake in our big house in Switzerland. Let's write ghost stories." And of course, Mary Shelley, as she then was, wrote Frankenstein, which clearly bears the mark of those ideas of creating life by electricity, although she doesn't actually mention what the mysterious force is that Dr. Frankenstein, or Victor Frankenstein, he was no doctor, that Victor Frankenstein used to make the monster come to life. She doesn't actually say that, but all the films have electricity, and I think that's okay.
So Mary Shelley is the daughter of the feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, and
that's right. Absolutely. Mary, so yeah, you know the story.
Her stepfather was also the anarchist William Godwin.
Yeah, absolutely. So she was born into very radical, and that's why, you know, running off with Shelley is thing to do. And then a few years later, sadly, Shelley drowns. after having written a fantastic poem in 1819 about an event here in Manchester, which we still mark, which was an attack on the populace who wanted democracy and wanted the right to vote, an event called Peterloo. And one of Shelley's best poems is written about that and ends up with the famous lines, which are still read out today. Shake off like lions after slumber, like lions after slumber, the chains that have fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. So there you go. Bit of politics in there.
Yes. Okay. Sir, so was the discovery of electricity a very watershed moment?
It provided people with, I mean, I talked about machinery, and it provided people with a whole new set of metaphors to try and understand what the brain does and how it does it. So some thinkers immediately, they discovered and they'd mastered electricity, and you could generate it and then send it across whole countries, whole continents. With the development of the railway, you got the development of the telegraph system, and that's why at the side of our railways we can see the telephone lines. Now, in the old days, they would have been the telegraph system, and people drew an analogy between the way that the telegraph system spread over a country, with all the lines going to the capital. In the case of the UK, that'd be London, and the way that the nerves in the body all go to the head. And it was seen both ways, this metaphor. They argued both that just as the brain directs the body and sends information, as they put it, down the nerves, so too the government directs the provinces. So the country was seen as a body, and the body was seen as having these telegraph systems. And some thinkers argued that it is exactly the same, that the brain is telegraphing information. But the problem with the telegraph is that it's fixed. You go from there to there, and that's it. There's no nuance in it. There's no plasticity. And by the end of the century, with Cahal and others doing neuroanatomy, it became obvious that there was plasticity. Nervous systems weren't identical. They changed over time. And at the same time, by the 1880s, there's a new technology appeared, which very quickly was adopted as a metaphor for how the brain worked. And that's the telephone exchange, which most young people have no idea how it works unless they've studied the history of technology or have watched a lot of old films. But basically, it's plastic. You pick up the telephone and speak to an operator. The operator then connects you physically, puts two wires into two slots, into the number from your number into the number where you want to talk to. And if you want to talk to another number, she can put it there. So the brain has got this flexibility. The telephone exchange has got a flexibility about it and an idea of routing information that seemed to fit with ideas about how the brain might work. Although this goes back to the 1880s, I have seen neuroscientists in the last 10 years saying, well, the brain is like a switchboard, which it clearly isn't. But this is the theme of the book, that we use metaphors to try and understand the natural world, not only the brain, but all aspects of the natural world. About the only thing that doesn't use metaphors is mathematics, because it's got its own language, which is the language of equations and the symbols it uses. But everything else uses metaphors of some kind or another that are inaccurate. Physicists talk about spin in their particles, which for people like me means that these are little billiard balls whizzing around, but it's not at all like that. So it's actually a problem, because the word spin misguides you, pushes you down a way of understanding the material that is incorrect. So sometimes metaphors are a problem, and physicists in there more recently, a lot of their names are Greek, electron and muon and all the rest of it. But if you think about the most recent aspects of that they've talked about, they've looked about quark, strangeness, and the strange quark, they've got the up and
Quark.
down quark, which they shouldn't have, because that again suggests that they're there and there, which they're not. But the very word quark was chosen because it has no meaning. It didn't. In fact, it's a kind of cheese in Switzerland. So physicists like buying this cheese, this processed cheese, because it's got quark written on it. But neuroscience has been focused on the use on technology, which it can then use as a way to try and explain what the brain might be doing. So we had Descartes' hydraulic statues, then we had primitive forms of electricity, then the telegraph system, then the telephone exchange, and even trying to understand what's in neurons, what are they doing, how are they behaving. That again took from technology, and a man called Edgar Adrian, who was the first person to record from single cells, single neurons. He talked about there being a code that they were transmitting. These words, transmit, code, they're the language, they're an electronic language. Yeah. And all this comes to fruition after the First World War. So the First World War, as all wars, saw the development of new technology in order to better kill people. And although a lot of that was, we think of tanks and we think of aeroplanes, that's true. But there was also the development of primitive electronics. Valves were developed, amplifiers, so that you could hear radio signals from afar, so you could communicate with the airplane that's up there. The soldiers could say, no, you've missed the target, you've got to fire somewhere else. So all this led to the development of new technology, which Adrian then applied, because the electrical activity in a neuron is so weak, so feeble, he needed very powerful amplifiers. The war provided him with them. It also provided him with a language of code and even of information to start thinking about what's in neurons. So this is in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And strikingly, Adrian does this not in his scientific articles, which are very kind of dull and neutral. He writes this way in his popular books, his books for the people, for ordinary people to understand what on earth he's doing. So he's trying to explain it in the simplest, most attractive way possible. So he gropes for this metaphor, and we're still living with that today. And the final element, and my book's divided into three halves, two proper halves and then a very short half. So it's divided basically into the past and the present. And the past deals with the development of all these metaphors that I've described, culminating in the development of the computer, and the digital computer in particular, in the second half of the 1940s. And what's striking, so we think about the brain, people say, well, the brain's like a computer, and computers can do amazing things, and the brain can, it processes information, etc., etc. But initially, the computer was built to be like a brain. So the very structure of the devices that we are all using, that I'm speaking to you through, the structure, the deep structure of these computers, these digital computers, is based on a von Neumann architecture. John von Neumann, famous mathematician, who designed the first digital computers. And the basis upon which they're constructed are a series of logical statements, if, or, then, not, and so on. And this is programming language, but it's also how circuits function, how they're put together, and that logical basis. But that structure he took from a very speculative article by my mind's gone a blank. What are their names again? Yeah, no. Very speculative article.
Adrian.
No. So doesn't matter. McCulloch and Pitts. There we go.
Okay.
So 1943. It takes a bit of time. 1943. They write this article in which they claim that nervous systems are built along this logical structure, that what are called synapses, which are the way that two cells speak to each other, two neurons speak to each other. There are different forms of synapses, and some of them form an if gate. Some of them are then, some of them are not. And they said, look, this is how the brain works. Now, neuroscientists or neurophysiologists and neuroanatomists just said, no, they're not. This is rubbish. Ignore this. But von Neumann paid a great deal of attention. He said, right. And in his document to the US government, written in 1944,